It was, as several of the villagers later insisted, a most ordinary evening, the kind of dull, well-bred twilight that English Novembers seem to specialize in, when the bell at Dowerby St. Luke rang its last for evensong, and the vicar's wife found the body. The churchyard lay in a shallow hollow below the rectory, the fog rising from it like something half-curdled. Inside the nave, the small congregation shuffled into their pews with the precise melancholy of those who have long ceased to expect anything interesting from Providence. Miss Annie Clegg, the organist, was playing Abide With Me in a manner both apologetic and tremulous, and the vicar, Reverend Hubert Lanchester, had just ascended the pulpit to deliver his brief remarks on the Book of Job. Outside, however, there was someone else, someone who never came in. At 10 minutes past 7, the bell ceased. By 20 past, Mrs. Lanchester, hurrying home to rescue the roast before it became an abomination, noticed the open vestry door. She stepped inside, murmuring something about draughts and careless vergers, and stopped short. Mr. Arthur Welby, the churchwarden, benefactor, and local tyrant, was lying face down beside the cassock press, his right arm bent grotesquely beneath him, and the silver collection plate crushed beneath his head. The candle had guttered out beside him, leaving only the faint smell of tallow and iron in the cold air. By 8 o'clock, the church was ringed with constables, and the fog was thick enough to make halos round their lanterns. Reverend Lanchester, pale but not entirely displeased by the drama, murmured to his wife that he had always said Arthur's zeal for the temporal order would come to no good. "Quite so," said a voice from behind him, light, amused, and carrying just enough authority to still the murmuring crowd. "Though I fancy Mr. Welby's present disorder may owe more to a blunt instrument than to divine retribution." Lord Peter Wimsey stepped into the circle of light as though he'd been there all along. His tall figure was wrapped in a grey ulster, the brim of his hat tipped just so against the drizzle. He bent over the body with the detached curiosity of a man examining an unfamiliar species of beetle. "Curious," he murmured. "One doesn't often see a man with the means to buy a silver salver choose instead to bleed upon it." The village constable, a square, flustered fellow named Briggs, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but the deceased was alive not half an hour ago. I saw him myself, locking up the vestry after the bell." "Half an hour," repeated Wimsey softly. "A liturgy, a sermon, and a murder, all neatly contained within the time it takes to burn a single candle. Efficient, if nothing else." He stood, brushing the dust from his gloves, and peered round the vestry with quick, bird-like glances. The candle stub, the mark on the flagstone, the faint scent of pipe, tobacco, curiously out of place in a house of prayer. "Tell me, Reverend," said Wimsey, turning suddenly, "was the sermon particularly stirring this evening?" On the sufferings of Job," stammered Lanchester, "and the vanity of worldly possessions." Wimsey's lips twitched. "Ah, the irony is delicious." He straightened, hands in pockets, eyes dancing with that air of infuriating amusement which usually preceded one of his miracles of deduction. "Mr. Briggs," he said lightly, "I shall stay at the rectory tonight. Kindly see that no one leaves the village until morning. There is something distinctly unscriptural about this affair." "Unscrip?" began Briggs. "Yes. For one thing," said Wimsey, glancing once more at the crushed salver, "our good Mr. Welby seems to have been struck down not by sin, but by schedule." And with that, he turned on his heel and vanished into the mist, humming "Abide With Me," half an octave too high. The following morning broke thin and grey, as if the world itself were reluctant to admit the previous night's disturbance had occurred. A faint drizzle persisted, blurring the edges of the rectory garden and making the church tower appear to float uneasily above the mist. Inside, Lord Peter Wimsey sat at the breakfast table of the Reverend and Mrs. Lanchester, staring at his eggs as though they were an experiment in metaphysics. Mrs. Lanchester, still pale from shock, poured tea with mechanical precision, while her husband attempted to maintain a tone of clerical optimism that fooled neither of them. "It is most extraordinary," he was saying, "that such a thing could occur here, of all places. Arthur was a difficult man, yes, but devoted, scrupulous about accounts, particular about the choir boy's punctuality. Surely no one could wish him harm." Whimsy smiled faintly. "My dear Reverend, I've yet to encounter a man so devoted to punctuality that someone did not wish him harm. It's one of those moral virtues that inspire universal irritation. Tell me, did he keep the church keys himself?" Lanchester hesitated. He did. He liked to say that sacred spaces required secular oversight. "Indeed," murmured Whimsy. "And yet he ended his days under the same roof as his oversight. There's a sermon in that." Mrs. Lanchester shivered. "If you intend to question the servants, my lord, I should warn you they're most upset. Briggs was here at dawn, poking about the pantry as though the murderer might be hiding behind the preserves. I told him that was nonsense, but he insisted upon it." "Quite right, too," said Whimsy cheerfully. "Murderers have a deplorable fondness for domestic convenience. Where are your people now?" A few minutes later, they assembled in the servants' hall, a dreary chamber smelling faintly of linseed oil and boiled cabbage. There were three of them: Jenkins, the gardener, a wiry man with a face like a walnut; Emily Drew, the housemaid, red-eyed and nervous; and Mrs. Platt, the cook, who regarded Whimsy with a kind of matronly suspicion. "Now then," said Whimsy pleasantly, pulling up a chair, "we shall proceed upon the revolutionary assumption that none of you killed Mr. Welby. The trouble, you see, with revolutionary assumptions is that they so often collapse under questioning. Let's see how this one fares." Mrs. Platt sniffed audibly. "We've nothing to hide, sir. We was all in the kitchen during prayers." "Ask the vicar." "Oh, I shall," said Whimsy. "But I prefer to begin at the bottom of the hierarchy. It's where truth usually hides. Emily, my child, you look as though you've seen a ghost." "I didn't, my lord," she stammered. "Leastways, not exactly. Well, when I went to draw the vestry curtains after service, the lamp was out, and there was that dreadful smell. I thought it was the candle. I never looked closer." "Naturally," said Whimsy. "The English instinct for avoiding unpleasantness is what keeps our civilization afloat. Did you notice if the vestry window was open?" "A crack, maybe," she whispered. "Mr. Welby never liked it closed all the way. Said the candles smoked." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "And yet last night was damp enough to make even righteousness shiver. Curious." He turned to Jenkins. "You, I take it, was somewhere among the rose bushes." "I locks the gate at 6, same as always," said Jenkins defensively. "Didn't see no one, heard the bell though. Funny thing, the last chime sounded off like the clapper stuck." "Off, you say?" Whimsy leaned forward. "Could you tell whether it was muffled deliberately or merely tired?" Jenkins blinked. "Didn't notice, sir. Bells don't talk to me." "They do to some people," said Whimsy softly, half to himself. "Never mind. And Mrs. Platt, you were occupied with the roast, I believe?" "I was, and it's ruined, and now there's talk of murder in the parish." She folded her arms. "I suppose next you'll be asking about my carving knife." "Only if it left the kitchen," said Whimsy amiably. "Which it did not, I take it?" "Certainly not." "Excellent. You see, Mrs. Platt, when everyone is so sure they know nothing, it usually means they've all noticed something worth knowing. Let me make a list. An open window, a strange smell, a dull bell, and a ruined roast. A poem of domestic tragedy, if ever there was one." He rose, leaving the servants bewildered, and strolled to the churchyard path. The drizzle had become a steady rain, beading upon the tombstones. Briggs emerged from behind a yew, looking both proud and miserable. "We've been over every inch, my lord." "Nothing but footprints, mostly our own." "Ah, the curse of zeal," murmured Whimsy. "Tell me, Briggs, What sort of man was Welby when not sanctified by death? Briggs shrugged. Particular? Loud. Didn't like lads loitering by the gate. Said the Lord's house wasn't a tavern. And yet he was fond of his own comforts, I gather. Liked his port, Briggs admitted, and his books. Bit queer about them, always sending for parcels from London. Indeed. Theology. Couldn't say. Foreign names, mostly. Whimsy's eyes brightened faintly. Foreign names and church plate? What a suggestive combination. You may go, Briggs, but keep an eye on the vestry door. Locks, like consciences, have a habit of failing at inconvenient times. By noon, Whimsy had toured the entire church, moving with that combination of absent-mindedness and acute focus that so confounded observers. He noted the wax drip on the lectern, the faint scuff mark beneath the north window, the single folded hymn sheet lying on the third pew. At one point, he paused, listening. Somewhere in the belfry above, a pigeon shifted uneasily. He smiled. Even the birds are troubled, he murmured. One wonders what they heard when the bell misbehaved. At luncheon, Mrs. Lanchester apologized for the soup, and Whimsy complimented it extravagantly, then remarked, "It's a peculiar thing about sound. Most people think it travels evenly in all directions, but architecture has a way of making favorites. A stone wall will keep a secret for centuries, but a wooden door repeats it at once. Did your husband, by chance, lock the vestry from within?" "Always," she said. "He said there were pilferers about." Then whoever killed him either possessed his key or persuaded him to unlock it. A comforting thought. "Comforting," she gasped. "Certainly. It narrows the field. I dislike the idea of random murder. It suggests chaos, and I am temperamentally opposed to chaos." When she left the room in tears, Whimsy sighed and leaned back, lighting a cigarette. The smoke curled in delicate spirals toward the ceiling. "We have a body struck upon a plate, a sermon on vanity, a window ajar, and a bell that lied. There's method here, Briggs, though not the sort they teach at Scotland Yard." The constable shuffled. "You think it's local, my lord?" "Oh, intimately so. Nothing in the world smells quite like a parochial murder. It's a blend of incense and blackmail, with a hint of damp hymn books. Tell me, have you examined the man's pockets?" "Empty," said Briggs. "No wallet, no watch. But his cufflinks were still there. Silver, with initials." "Initials?" "A.W., same as his name." "And yet," said Whimsy quietly, "Welby's middle name was Thomas. Curious that he'd order monogrammed silver with the wrong letters." Briggs frowned. "Could be someone else's. Or could be that Mr. Welby had reason to hide his own possessions under another man's name. I should like to see his study." They crossed the rectory lawn, the rain muttering against their hats. The study was a narrow room lined with theological works and ledgers. On the desk lay a stack of correspondence, neatly arranged. Whimsy flipped through it, humming under his breath. Receipts, bank statements, and one curious envelope with a foreign stamp. Inside was a pamphlet printed in German, the title half-torn, "Über das Schweigen der Glocken, on the silence of bells." He turned it over in his hands. "A monograph on acoustics," he murmured. "Or perhaps on something less respectable. Do you know German, Briggs?" "Only the beer names." "Then we are safe from contamination. Still, a church warden studying the silence of bells is like a butcher studying vegetarianism. There's something deliciously inconsistent about it." He replaced the pamphlet and straightened. "You see, Briggs, everyone swears they heard nothing at all, but the bells did. And they'll tell me presently who silenced them." That evening, as dusk returned to drape the churchyard in its usual melancholy, Whimsy stood beneath the tower, watching the fog curl round the gravestones. The vicar's sermon on Job echoed faintly in his mind, though he could not recall a word of it. "The patience of Job," he murmured. "How admirable, how impractical. He smiled to himself, a small, sharp smile that belonged more to mischief than comfort. Tomorrow we shall test the patience of Dowerby St. Luke. For if there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence, like virtue, rarely survives close examination. And with that, he turned toward the rectory lights, where the next revelation, as inevitable as dawn, was already waiting. The morning after was clearer, the fog burned away by a sharp, colourless light that showed every flaw in the world. Lord Peter Wimsey emerged from the rectory with a briskness that alarmed the vicar's hens, which scattered indignantly across the gravel path. He carried a notebook and an umbrella, but seemed to use both as conversational props rather than for any practical purpose. Briggs trailed behind him, still looking uncertain as to whether this whole affair was a murder or some kind of aristocratic jest. "We've checked the church, the vestry, and the yard twice over, my lord," he protested. "There's not a thing we've missed." "Oh, Briggs, my dear soul, there's always something missed," said Wimsey cheerfully. "The universe thrives on omission. Entire philosophies depend upon what isn't noticed. Come along, I'm interested in the acoustics." "The what?" "Acoustics, Briggs. The behavior of sound. Bells, hymns, whispered prayers, and possibly the faint thud of a man being struck on the skull. You recall our friend Welby's pamphlet? On the silence of bells. I have a suspicion he wasn't studying theology." They entered the church, which smelt faintly of stone dust and last night's candle smoke. Wimsey paced the aisle, clapping his hands softly at intervals and listening to the echoes. "Hear that?" he said. "A short decay, slightly muffled, probably due to the drapery round the altar. But under the tower it changes. A man could shout murder here and be mistaken for the wind in the rafters. Most convenient if one wished to kill quietly during a service." Briggs frowned. "But there were people inside, my lord. They'd have heard." "Not if they were singing Abide With Me. I defy even conscience to compete with that hymn at full strength." He knelt beside the flagstone where Welby's body had been found and ran a gloved hand along the grooves. "There's been movement here. Look, the candle wax splashed in 2 directions, not 1. That means he fell twice." "Fell twice?" "First to his knees, then to his face. The blow didn't kill him instantly. He must have tried to rise." Wimsey's voice softened. "Poor devil. He was a fussy man, but he didn't deserve a clumsy death." Briggs muttered something about Providence, and Wimsey rose, brushing dust from his coat. "Providence, Briggs, has a notoriously bad aim. No, this was human, imperfect, rushed, perhaps frightened. And the murderer was someone Welby knew. He wouldn't have turned his back otherwise." They left the church, and Wimsey paused on the steps, gazing toward the distant hedgerows where the lanes curved out of sight. "Tell me, who benefits from his death?" "His niece, Miss Agnes Welby," said Briggs promptly. "She's his only living relative, teaches piano at the village school. Nice young lady, doesn't seem the murdering kind." "Neither do vicars, grocers, or maiden aunts, until one inspects their bank statements," murmured Wimsey. "Let us pay Miss Welby a call." The niece lived in a small cottage behind the schoolhouse, with a cluttered piano that occupied half the parlour and a cat that occupied the rest. She received them with timid politeness, her pale face showing the sleeplessness of the bereaved. "It's dreadful, Lord Wimsey," she said. "Uncle Arthur could be difficult, but he meant well. He always said the church must stand above gossip. Now people are whispering that he was struck down for some secret sin." "Whispering is an English form of exercise," said Wimsey kindly. "Did your uncle confide in you?" "Not about church matters. Only that someone had been stealing from the offertory box. He was terribly upset. Said it was a profanation." "Indeed," said Wimsey. "Did he suspect anyone?" "He wouldn't say. Only that it had to be stopped before the next bell. I thought he meant before the next service." Wimsey's eyes flickered. "Before the next bell. Very choice phrasing. Did you visit him yesterday?" "No, I was practicing with the children until 6:30. Mrs. Lanchester can tell you. And after that? Home directly. I had a letter to write. To whom? She hesitated. To my fiancé. He's in London, an organ tuner. Appropriate, murmured Whimsy. The harmony of sound and death. There's poetry in it. She gave a faint gasp of indignation, and he bowed slightly. Forgive me. My tongue runs faster than my compassion. May I see the letter? She fetched it obediently. A plain envelope, half sealed, lay upon the desk. The postmark space was empty. Whimsy examined it, but said nothing, only noting the faint smear of candle grease upon the flap. When they left, Briggs asked, "What do you make of her, my lord?" "Sincere, frightened, and lying," said Whimsy cheerfully. "The question is, about what? She knows something, but not what it means. We mustn't frighten her further. Fear clouds recollection, and we require clarity." "You think she did it?" "Heaven forbid. I dislike symmetry in crime. It's too theatrical. No, she's part of the pattern, but not the design." He stopped abruptly by the church gate. "Briggs, have you noticed the clock tower?" "Only that it's late again." "Precisely. It's late by 10 minutes. Yet the bell that night rang exactly on time. How curious. A man obsessed with punctuality slain by a clock that lies." He tapped his notebook. "That, Briggs, is our red herring, and I propose to chase it until it squeals." That afternoon, the villagers watched with a mixture of awe and irritation as Whimsy climbed the bell tower ladder, whistling tunelessly. The bells hung like patient beasts, their ropes swaying gently. He inspected the mechanism, then the small shelf beside it. A bottle of oil, a rag, and a single cigarette stub. "Briggs," he called down, "was our victim a smoker?" "Pipe man, my lord." "Then this," said Whimsy, descending lightly, "belongs to someone else, possibly our killer. The tobacco's foreign, Turkish blend. Expensive, pretentious, and quite out of place in Dowerby St. Luke. Remind me who was at evensong?" "Half the village. The vicar and his wife, Miss Clegg the organist, Mrs. Platt, Jenkins, Emily Drew, and a few others. Oh, and Mr. Morton, the solicitor. He comes down weekends." "Ah, yes. The legal mind amid the spiritual ones. Tell me about him." "Quiet chap. Reads in the back pew. Keeps to himself. Solicitors always do. Their consciences need the space." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Let us pay him a pastoral visit." Mr. Morton's lodging was at the inn, a comfortable establishment that smelled of beer, polish, and reluctant hospitality. The solicitor was a neat, sandy-haired man with spectacles and an air of wary intelligence. "You'll forgive the intrusion," said Whimsy pleasantly, accepting the offered chair, "but I fancy you knew the late Mr. Welby rather well." "Professionally, yes," said Morton. "I drew up his will last year, a dull document, everything to his niece, save a small bequest to the church for maintenance of the bells." "How much?" £200. "A tidy sum to make bells behave." Morton smiled faintly. "Mr. Welby was proud of them. He said they were the only voices in Dowerby that never lied." "And yet," murmured Whimsy, "one of them did. Did he ever mention his studies? Acoustics, perhaps?" "Acoustics? No, though he was interested in certain foreign correspondence. Sent money abroad for manuscripts, I believe." "Ah, theology knows no customs barriers." Whimsy rose, shaking hands. "Thank you, Mr. Morton. You've clarified several things while pretending not to." Back outside, the wind had risen, tossing the bare branches against the sky. Briggs trudged beside him, muttering about theories. "What have we now, my lord? A niece, a solicitor, a bell and a cigarette. Doesn't make much sense." "Oh, it will, Briggs. Murder is like counterpoint. It sounds chaotic until one knows the key. I suspect our key lies in the bells themselves. They were meant to toll a warning, not conceal a crime." Yet someone silenced them, and in doing so, silenced Welby. The question is, what was he about to reveal? He paused, eyes narrowing. Perhaps it is time to make a little noise of our own. Tomorrow evening we shall ring the bells again, exactly as they were rung before evensong, and then, my dear Briggs, we shall see who trembles. That night, back at the rectory, Whimsy lingered by the fire with a glass of sherry, staring into the coals. Mrs. Lanchester had retired early, pleading fatigue. The vicar sat opposite, reading a book of sermons with a troubled air. "You've a theory, Lord Whimsy?" he ventured. "Oh, I have several," said Whimsy lightly, "all equally unsatisfactory, but I'm beginning to suspect that Mr. Welby's death was not his only misfortune. He was about to expose something that threatened more than one reputation. Blackmail. Or protection. One so easily becomes the other." He drained his glass and smiled. "Tomorrow will tell us. Bells are honest creatures, Reverend. They repeat what they hear, and somewhere among these pleasant Christian throats, one voice will crack." When the clock struck 10, late as always, Whimsy rose and drew the curtains. Outside, the church stood black against the moonlight, its tower a mute silhouette. He tapped his cigarette against the mantel and murmured, "Silence of bells, indeed, but tomorrow they shall speak, and heaven help the one who taught them to lie." Then, extinguishing the lamp, he left the room as quietly as a confession unspoken. The following evening arrived with a kind of theatrical punctuality that seemed to amuse Lord Peter Whimsy more than it should. The rain had stopped, the air was crisp, and a thin moon hung like a sliver of polished bone over the steeple of Dowerby St. Luke. By 6:30, a small crowd had gathered in the churchyard under the pretext of concern for the bells, though in truth it was curiosity that drew them, the same curiosity that binds all English villages tighter than faith or family. Whimsy moved among them with polite detachment, offering quips and small observations about meteorology, which was his habit when his mind was engaged elsewhere. Briggs, standing near the vestry door, watched with the expression of a man convinced that something unsanctioned was about to occur. Inside, Miss Clegg sat at the organ, hands trembling faintly over the keys, while Reverend Lanchester fussed with the hymn sheets and tried to appear both cooperative and authoritative. Whimsy had instructed that everything be done exactly as on the night of the murder. The same hymn, the same order, the same bell sequence. Only this time, he said, the sound would not go unanswered. "You see," he had remarked earlier with a smile, "the dead seldom speak, but their habits echo splendidly." When the first note of "Abide with me" drifted through the nave, Whimsy closed his eyes briefly, listening. The acoustics behaved precisely as he'd predicted. The swell of the organ swallowed the smaller noises. The choir's uneven voices blurred into a single droning mass, and the bells above seemed to fade rather than ring. He turned to Briggs. "Now imagine," he whispered, "a man entering the vestry at this moment, unseen by all, his footsteps masked by piety. He meets Welby there, Welby, who has discovered something intolerable. Perhaps he confronts the man. Words are exchanged, a blow is struck. No one hears it because sound itself is conspiring with the murderer. All very efficient, all very English." Briggs swallowed, eyes darting toward the darkened vestry door. "You mean to—" "Precisely. Let us oblige the murderer with a little theatre." As the final verse trembled to an end, Whimsy gave a subtle nod. A constable hidden near the belfry pulled the rope, and the bells began their solemn peal, identical to that fateful night. Their tone filled the church and rolled across the village in waves, bright and hollow. Then, quite suddenly, Whimsy stepped away from the pew and disappeared through the vestry arch. Briggs followed a moment later but found no sign of him, only the candlelight flickering over the cassock press and a faint draught from the half-open window. "My lord?" he called softly. There was no reply. Then, from the darkness beyond the window, came a sound that was not quite a shout and not quite laughter. something sharp, broken, and instantly smothered. Briggs stumbled forward just as the bells ceased. The silence that followed was immense, like the world had been emptied. Then Whimsy's voice emerged from the shadows, cool and faintly amused. "You may come in now, Reverend, and perhaps bring Miss Clegg if she's not too overcome. I think the music has served its purpose." When the vicar and his trembling organist entered, they found Whimsy standing beside the window, holding up a small brass object between thumb and forefinger. "A tuning key," he said. "Rather a fine one, too. Belongs to a set used for organ maintenance. Miss Clegg, does it look familiar?" She stammered that she had never seen it before, her eyes darting between the window and the gleaming tool. Whimsy smiled thinly. "Then I must congratulate your tuner, Miss Welby's fiancé. It appears he left his signature." The revelation rippled through the church like the chill of an unseen draught. Briggs blinked. "You mean he'd done it, my lord?" "Not necessarily," said Whimsy, "but this, dropped here of all places, tells me our murderer had access to the vestry through the window, and that he, or she, knew precisely when the bells would cover their approach, which narrows our circle delightfully." He turned toward the vicar. "Reverend, do you recall whether Mr. Welby ever allowed outsiders to handle the organ?" "Heavens, no," said Lanchester. "He thought music a necessary evil, tolerated only for its moral influence." "Then the presence of this key is not ecclesiastical, but personal. Our killer is someone intimate with Miss Welby's household or her affections." At that very moment, a figure appeared in the doorway. Agnes Welby herself, pale and wild-eyed, her cloak askew. "You've no right," she cried. "You've no right to torment him." "On the contrary, Miss Welby," said Whimsy gently. "I've every right. It's my chief amusement. Whom are we tormenting tonight? Your uncle's murderer or your conscience?" She froze, trembling. "You don't understand. Gerald didn't kill him. He couldn't." "Then perhaps you'll explain how his tuning key arrived in a locked vestry window, one that only opened after the sermon." "He was here that afternoon," she said desperately. "To check the pipes. Uncle Arthur didn't like it, but he allowed it just once. Gerald must have dropped it then." "How touching," murmured Whimsy. "But the window was polished clean yesterday morning. I saw the cloth marks myself. Whoever dropped this did so last night." She gasped and pressed her hands to her mouth. Briggs took a step forward, but Whimsy raised a hand. "No arrests, please. Not yet. We're still missing one note in the harmony." He began pacing slowly, his voice turning almost conversational. Mr. Welby was a man of order, lists, schedules, precise hours, but he also kept secrets. Money sent abroad under false initials, a pamphlet about silence. And then there's our bell, struck wrong at the final chime. The mechanism had been tampered with. Someone dampened the clapper with oil to muffle the sound. That's why Jenkins thought it stuck. Now who would know enough to do that? He looked at Agnes. "Your fiancé, perhaps, or the organist, whose music depends upon measured sound." Miss Clegg gave a strangled cry. I only wanted quiet." Everyone turned. "He was cruel," she blurted. "Always complaining, always mocking my playing. Said I made the church sound like a sick room. I only wanted him to stop." "So you oiled the bell," said Whimsy softly. "To still his noise. To teach him. I never meant—" She broke off, staring at the floor. "I never meant him to die." The room held its breath. Whimsy regarded her gravely, all amusement gone. "You didn't strike him, did you?" "No," she whispered. "I left before prayers. I couldn't bear it any longer. He was in the vestry, muttering about thieves. I swear he was alive when I went." "Then someone followed," said Whimsy. "Someone who knew of the quarrel and saw opportunity. Your foolish trick provided the silence he needed." He turned suddenly toward the vicar, whose hand trembled upon his cassock. "Tell me, Reverend, how did you find the sermon last night?" What do you mean?" "You preached on the vanity of possessions, I believe. A curious choice for a man recently refused a loan by his churchwarden. Lanchester's face drained of colour. You've no proof of that. On the contrary, said Wimsey softly, producing a folded paper. Mr. Morton was most helpful. A note in your hand requesting £100 for urgent private reasons. Welby denied you. You owed him bitterness and opportunity. For a moment, only the rain against the windows broke the silence. Then the vicar sank onto a pew, face buried in his hands. He taunted me, he whispered. Said the church would sooner fund a new organist than a dishonest parson. I went to reason with him. He turned his back. I struck out. It was only to silence him for a moment. I didn't know. His voice trailed away. Wimsey exhaled slowly. And thus, my dear Reverend, the silence of bells becomes the silence of conscience, fitting in a macabre way. Briggs moved forward, but Wimsey shook his head again. Let him finish his prayers first. Justice can wait until the Amen. Later, as the constables led Lanchester away through the churchyard, Wimsey remained behind, staring at the darkened altar. Agnes lingered near the door, her face a blur of tears and disbelief. How did you know? She whispered. Because, he said quietly, only a man obsessed with sin would strike another down beside a silver salver and call it righteousness. The rest merely provided the music. She turned away, sobbing, and he looked upward toward the silent belfry. Strange thing, Briggs, he said when the constable rejoined him. In this world, people will kill for almost any reason, love, pride, piety, but rarely for money alone. It's too honest a motive. A grim sort of comfort, my lord. Yes, said Wimsey softly, but comfort all the same. Now let's leave these good people to their prayers. I fancy the bells will ring truer now they've been heard. And with that, he stepped into the chill night, his umbrella tapping in rhythm with the distant, patient toll of justice finding its note at last. The following day dawned unnaturally, bright, the kind of morning that feels like an apology after a night of sin. Dowerby St. Luke was a village returned to order, at least on the surface. The milk delivered, the smoke rising from chimneys, the church door unbolted for those few brave souls who believed divine mercy extended to gossip. But inside the rectory, quiet unease lingered like an uninvited guest. Lord Peter Wimsey, immaculate in a light tweed suit despite the damp grass outside, was seated in the study with his usual air of cheerful idleness. The papers spread before him suggested leisure, yet every gesture betrayed calculation. The slow turning of a letter, the measured tap of his cigarette case, the slight furrow between his brows when a clue threatened to resist arrangement. Briggs stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hand, still shaken from the night's confession. So it's over, then, he ventured at last. The Reverend done it, clear as daylight. My dear Briggs, said Wimsey mildly, daylight is a treacherous thing. It shows only what stands still, never what moves. Lanchester struck the blow, yes, but I doubt we've seen the end of this particular morality play. Briggs frowned. You mean someone else helped? Helped? No. But sin, like music, has harmonics. One note vibrates another. I've been thinking of our friend Mr. Morton, the solicitor with a taste for discretion. He appeared last night at a most inconvenient moment, don't you think? Did he? Oh, yes. Arrived just after the bells ceased, all sympathy and paperwork. Said he'd come to comfort the widow, forgetting, perhaps, that vicars' wives aren't widows until the arrest is official. Wimsey smiled thinly. No, there's a coda to this symphony, and I'd rather play it myself before Scotland Yard begins tuning its instruments. By mid-morning, he was walking the lane toward the village inn, cane swinging idly, face turned to the watery sunlight. Mr. Morton was breakfasting in the parlour, his calm expression betraying nothing of curiosity or guilt. Lord Wimsey, he said, rising politely. A tragic affair. The papers will make much of it, no doubt. Clergy and crime sell splendidly. Quite so, said Whimsy, accepting the coffee offered, though I fancy the public prefers its parsons hypocritical rather than homicidal. Tell me, Mr. Morton, did you find your late client's affairs in order? Perfectly. He was meticulous, a small estate, nothing sensational. And yet you were present so conveniently last night. Mere coincidence? I was walking. The bells drew me in. I had no notion of the horror inside. Indeed, said Whimsy, studying him over the rim of his cup. Curious that a man so fond of accuracy should forget that he told me earlier he never attended evening services. I make a habit of believing liars only on alternate days, and today is rather awkwardly the wrong one. Morton's composure wavered. If you imply— My dear fellow, interrupted Whimsy pleasantly, I imply everything. It saves time. You see, there's a small irregularity in Mr. Welby's correspondence. Money sent abroad to a firm in Zurich. The name on the receipts was yours, neatly disguised as a client's trust, a clever arrangement until the churchwarden began to suspect he was funding something less sacred than theology. Morton's lips thinned. You've no proof. Proof is such a vulgar concept, said Whimsy airily. But motive, now, that's an art. Welby discovers the discrepancy, perhaps threatens exposure. You, knowing his piety and vanity, imagine he'll forgive you after a sermon or two. Instead, he marches to the vestry and prepares to make it public. Unfortunately, our reverend, consumed by wounded pride, provides you the perfect scapegoat. You see the quarrel, you see the blow, and you realize Providence has handed you salvation on a cassock sleeve. All that remains is silence, and what better tool for silence than a bell already dampened? You cannot prove I was there, said Morton quietly. No one saw me. Ah, but someone heard you. Whimsy rose, glancing toward the inn window where the tower of Dowerby St. Luke loomed faintly through mist. Miss Clegg mentioned a curious sound between verses last night, a metallic tap, out of rhythm. She thought it was a flaw in the pipes. I think it was you, dropping your cufflink as you replaced the window catch. The vestry floor is most obliging to memory. At noon, a telegram arrived from London, confirming Whimsy's suspicion. The Zurich account had been emptied the day after Welby's death, and Morton's name, albeit initialed, was attached to the withdrawal. When confronted, he made one last attempt at irony. You're clever, Lord Whimsy, but meddling in other men's mistakes isn't quite the same as understanding them. Possibly not, said Whimsy, but it pays better in reviews. The arrest was quiet, almost courteous, like a business meeting adjourned without enthusiasm. Briggs, watching, scratched his head. So both of them guilty, in their ways. Indeed, one killed for pride, the other for profit. Between them they make a perfect sermon. 2 sins, 1 corpse, and a village returned to normality. You must admit, Briggs, it's practically biblical. Aye, but you don't look pleased, my lord. Whimsy smiled faintly. I seldom am when the conclusion is tidy. It smacks of bad fiction. That evening, as the light faded over the churchyard, Whimsy returned alone to the vestry. The place had been scrubbed, polished, restored to piety, but he could still smell the faint ghost of tallow and iron. He stood by the window where the candle had guttered and touched the sill with something like affection. You've seen it all, haven't you? He murmured. The sermons, the quarrels, the small hypocrisies polished into virtue. You know, my dear Stone, we English make such an art of repression that when we do commit murder, we do it politely. He smiled to himself and wandered into the nave, where the evening sun filtered through the stained glass in fractured hues. The colors fell upon the pews like silent witnesses, crimson for guilt, blue for remorse, gold for nothing at all. It's rather beautiful, he said softly. Crime gives the place character. Without it, one might almost mistake Dowerby for heaven. As he lingered there, Miss Agnes Welby entered quietly, her face drawn but composed. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for finding the truth." "Truth," repeated Whimsy, "is a beast best approached with a chair and whip. Are you quite sure you wanted it found?" "Yes," she said after a pause. "Uncle Arthur was cruel, but he didn't deserve slander. And the vicar, poor man, he lost more than his faith long before this." "You're charitable, Miss Welby." "Perhaps, but charity is easier when the dead are beyond offense." She smiled faintly. "You'll leave soon?" "Tomorrow." "I dislike lingering after the morale of the story is clear. Besides, the cook's roast remains unrepentantly tragic." "Then I hope," she said, glancing toward the bells above, "you'll at least stay long enough to hear them ring again." "Properly, this time." "Perhaps I shall," he said. "Atonement makes a pleasant soundtrack." Later that night, Whimsy dined alone, reading through his notes while the fire cracked and hissed. He wrote a brief letter to Inspector Parker in London, summarizing events in his usual elliptical fashion. Clerical melodrama. Sin, sound, and silverware. 2 culprits, both regrettably human. The bells are innocent. He sealed it, stretched, and poured himself a final glass of port. The rectory clock struck 9. Correctly for once. He laughed softly. Miracles abound. Even machinery responds to scandal. Stepping to the window, he looked out toward the church where the moon now hung directly above the tower. The bells began to ring. Not the mournful toll of tragedy, but a clear, clean peal that filled the air like absolution. Whimsy listened, eyes half closed. "There now," he murmured. "Order restored, and all sins properly catalogued. If only the Almighty kept records so neatly." He finished his port, set the glass aside, and turned down the lamp. When Briggs came in the next morning, Whimsy was already packed. "Off again, my lord?" he asked. "As ever," said Whimsy. "There's a murder in Suffolk that promises more imagination than remorse. I'm told it involves a poisoned manuscript and a bishop's niece. Delightfully literary." Briggs grinned, saluting awkwardly. "Safe travels, then." "Thank you. And do give my regards to the bells. Tell them I prefer them honest." He stepped outside into the pale spring sunlight, hat tilted just so, coat swinging with effortless elegance. The air smelled of damp earth and faint redemption. Behind him, the bells of Dowerby St. Luke began another measured toll, steady and clear. He paused only once, glancing back toward the churchyard with something between fondness and irony. "Amen," he said softly. "And may all sermons henceforth be shorter." Then Lord Peter Whimsy walked down the lane and disappeared into the morning, leaving behind a village cleansed, a conscience bruised, and a silence far more peaceful than the one that had begun it all. London received Lord Peter Whimsy with its usual indifferent sprawl of smoke and handsome horns, the city humming with that peculiar mixture of impatience and self-importance which had always amused him. He took rooms for a few days at his club, content to let civilization's noise drown out the echo of Dowerby's bells. The newspapers, of course, had already devoured the story. "The Sin of the Vestryman," screamed one headline, while another preferred clergyman's quarrel ends in tragedy. Whimsy perused them over breakfast, chuckling softly at the solemn idiocy of the prose. "They make morality sound like a spectator sport," he murmured, folding the Morning Gazette with distaste. Yet somewhere beneath his amusement lay a dull ache, an irritation that refused to dissolve even under the club's excellent coffee. He knew the case was closed, the conclusions tidy, but the human soul, he reflected, was never tidy for long. Perhaps that was what made murder so interesting. It was merely the final proof that logic alone could not domesticate emotion. He rose, rang for his coat, and decided that a walk through Bloomsbury might clear the fog of thought that clung to him worse than any London soot. The day was brisk, with a wind sharp enough to make one's eyes water, and the pavements gleamed faintly from the night's rain. As he strolled past the bookshops, Whimsy found himself glancing automatically at window displays, half expecting to see Welby's German pamphlet on Bell Silence perched absurdly among the theology. Instead, a thin volume titled Echoes of the Faithful caught his eye, a treatise on church architecture and sound resonance by one Reverend Hubert Lanchester, published 3 years prior. "Well, well," he murmured, stepping closer. The author's name seemed to shimmer faintly, ghost-like beneath the glass. He bought it, of course, curiosity being the one vice he saw no reason to repent, and retired to a cafe to read. The prose was dull but precise, every sentence crafted with moral pedantry. Yet one paragraph made him pause. The vestry must be built so that no word within carries beyond its door, for confession requires silence as surely as faith requires sound. He smiled grimly. And confession did require silence, didn't it, old boy? You engineered your own tomb. He sat there longer than he meant to, the cafe growing louder with lunchtime chatter until the absurdity of his own brooding struck him. He was not built for melancholy. His nature rebelled against it like a cat against rain. Still there lingered a question, one small, persistent imperfection in the otherwise perfect equation of guilt and cause. Why had Welby, of all people, summoned him? For it had been a letter from the dead man, received 2 days before the murder, that brought him to Dowerby in the first place. "My Lord Whimsy," it had said in a crabbed hand, "I have reason to believe a scandal threatens our parish of a nature too delicate for the authorities. I entreat your discretion and intelligence." Nothing in that letter suggested the man expected death. Rather, he anticipated revelation. And revelation, Whimsy mused, was seldom fatal unless truth had chosen an inconvenient listener. Could it be that someone besides Morton and Lanchester had known of the thefts? Or was there, buried beneath the polite lies, yet another strand to be tugged? That evening, over a quiet dinner at his flat, he unfolded the parish ledgers that Morton's firm had forwarded at his request. Numbers and names marched neatly across the pages, but one entry stopped him short. A donation listed 6 months prior from an anonymous benefactor. £200, the exact sum later diverted to the Bell Fund. "Circular benevolence," he murmured. "The money leaves one pocket only to reappear in another. How very Anglican." But the handwriting was different, more flowing, more confident than Welby's cramped script. He compared it to Lanchester's, to Morton's, to the niece's letter. None matched precisely. A forgery, perhaps, but a deliberate one. He leaned back, cigarette in hand, staring at the curling smoke. Anonymous, indeed. The living are seldom so generous without reason. A knock interrupted his reverie. Parker, faithful as ever, entered with that mixture of casual friendship and professional gravity that made him so endlessly useful. "You're brooding again, Peter," he said. "I thought Dowerby was wrapped up neatly." "Neatly, yes," said Whimsy, "but not elegantly. There's a difference. Sit down, my dear Charles. The whiskey's in its usual place. Tell me, do you believe in second acts? In the theatre or in crime?" "Both, naturally." Parker poured himself a glass. "Depends on the playwright. Most murderers prefer one-act dramas. Keeps the audience awake." Whimsy grinned. "Ah, but our dear Welby seems to have left behind an encore. Look at this entry." Parker scanned the ledger, frowning. £200. Anonymous donor. Could be anyone. Precisely. Yet it's the same sum Morton later transferred abroad under Welby's authority. I suspect our warden discovered the embezzlement too early, months before his death, and tried to mask it with an anonymous donation. He meant to recover the funds quietly. But someone noticed. Morton? Possibly. But Morton struck me as a man reactive, not inventive. No, I think there's another figure. A silent partner. The next morning, Whimsy visited Morton's office in Lincoln's Inn. The clerks eyed him nervously, as though guilt might be contagious. Morton himself, pale from a sleepless night in custody, received him with polite resignation. "Come to gloat, Lord Whimsy." "Hardly," said Whimsy. "I dislike triumph when it lacks artistry. Tell me, did anyone else know about the Zurich arrangement?" Morton hesitated. "No one living, I suppose. Except the agent who handled the transfers. Mr. Daltrey. He managed several ecclesiastical trusts." "Daltrey," repeated Whimsy, filing the name away. "And he resides?" "Cheltenham, I think." Whimsy thanked him and departed before the man could begin protesting his innocence anew. By late afternoon, a wire from Cheltenham confirmed that Daltrey had died suddenly 3 weeks after Welby's murder. Heart failure, officially, though his papers were regrettably disordered. Whimsy stared at the telegram for a long moment, then gave a low whistle. 3 sins and counting. Pride, greed, and now the tidy vanity of concealment. We've nearly enough for a sermon. Parker raised an eyebrow. "You think someone silenced Daltrey?" "Someone or something. Perhaps guilt has better aim than Providence after all." He sighed. "But I think the curtain may as well fall here. The living culprits are caught, the dead have confessed in absentia, and the bells, the bells, are free to ring without deceit." That night, sleep eluded him. The city outside roared like an untamed sermon, cabs clattering, voices rising and fading, the hum of electricity replacing Dowerby's rural hush. He lay awake, watching the faint light from the street lamps trace patterns across the ceiling. In his mind, the bells tolled again. Slow, deliberate, forgiving. He saw Welby's body beside the silver plate, the vicar's trembling hands, Morton's calm deceit, the frightened niece clutching her letter. So many little motives converging upon one moment of silence. Perhaps, he thought, the true murderer had been that silence itself, the cultivated English refusal to speak until the harm was done. He smiled faintly at the thought, amused by its own bleak poetry. "A murder by omission," he whispered. "One might almost call it national character." The next day he lunched with Harriet Vane, who listened to his account with raised brows and the faint smile of someone who understood too much. "You always look so disappointed when justice works," she teased. "It's indecent." "Not disappointed," he said, stirring his soup. "Merely realistic. Justice is the tidy part. Truth is the untidy one. And which do you prefer?" "The untidy, of course. It keeps one awake." She laughed softly. "Then you'll never retire, Peter." "No," he agreed. "Retirement requires a belief in endings, and I've yet to meet a crime that truly ends." He reached for her hand briefly, the gesture half careless, half grateful. "Still, I'm glad you listen. Without you, my thoughts echo like bells in an empty church." That evening, walking back alone, he passed a chapel where evensong was beginning. The bells rang, a clear, untroubled sound, and he paused, lifting his hat slightly as though in salute. The notes rose, shimmered, and faded into the London dusk. "Abide with me," he murmured, smiling, but not too closely. Then he turned the corner and vanished into the crowd, leaving behind only the faint impression of laughter carried away by the wind, and somewhere far off, the remembered toll of Dowerby St. Luke, blending imperceptibly with the heartbeat of the city. The weeks passed with the peculiar elasticity of time that follows the resolution of a great disturbance. The days seemed long, yet the memory of the case shrank almost instantly into the polite shadows of conversation. Society had already moved on to fresher scandals, more fashionable crimes, and Whimsy, much to his relief, was left once again to his own idleness. He spent his mornings reading minor Greek poets and his afternoons in vague contemplation of life's absurdities from the window of his Piccadilly flat. It was during one such idle afternoon that the matter of Dowerby unexpectedly returned. Not as a ghost or a regret, but as a letter. The envelope bore a provincial postmark and smelled faintly of lavender. Inside was a note, written in an elegant, somewhat hesitant hand. My Lord Whimsy, forgive the intrusion, but I have come upon something which I fear bears upon the late unhappy events in our parish. I cannot speak freely in writing. Might I entreat you to visit me, should you find yourself again in the north? Yours, faithfully, Agnes Welby. He read it twice, smiling faintly at the careful phrasing. A confession or a postscript, he murmured. Either way, the plot thickens after its conclusion. How deliciously improper. 3 days later, he was once again upon the train, the countryside unfolding like a forgotten novel outside his window. The fields were bright with the first green of early summer, and the air that came through the carriage window was sharp with the scent of rain. Dowerby St. Luke looked much the same, though perhaps cleaner, as though the village had washed its conscience. The bells, he noticed, were ringing again, steadily this time, without tremor or deceit. Miss Welby met him at the rectory gate, her expression a mixture of relief and embarrassment. "I'm so sorry to trouble you," she said as they shook hands, "but there has been, well, a discovery of sorts." "My dear Miss Welby," he replied, "trouble is my natural element. Without it, I should be forced to play golf." She smiled, though her eyes remained grave. "It's about my uncle's papers. We've begun to settle the estate, and I found something I can't quite make sense of." She led him into the rectory study, now hers by inheritance. The air smelled faintly of old ink and polish. Upon the desk lay a small tin box, unlocked. Inside were several letters tied with faded ribbon and a folded sheet of music. "He never cared for music," she said softly. "But this was hidden at the bottom of a drawer. Look here." She handed him the sheet, and he examined it. The notation was simple, a short piece marked Andante Moderato. Across the top was written in careful Latin, Ad Caelestem Silentium, to the heavenly silence. "A charming title," murmured Whimsy. "Did he compose it?" "I don't think so. There's another name beneath. The initials H.L. "Our repentant vicar," he said thoughtfully. The man did have a flair for irony. "But there's more," she said. "One of the letters. It's from Mr. Morton, dated 2 days before the murder." She handed it to him. The handwriting was tight, hurried. "My dear Welby," it read, "the matter of our transaction must be concluded at once. Delay is dangerous. Certain questions have been raised about the Zurich account. I trust you will remember our understanding. For both our sakes, discretion is essential." Whimsy folded it carefully and looked up. So Morton panicked first. He feared exposure before Welby even reached the pulpit, which means our good vicar struck the blow not merely out of wounded pride, but to silence a scandal he scarcely understood. A chain of silence, each link forged by cowardice. Miss Welby sat opposite him, twisting her hands together. "Do you think my uncle meant to confess?" "In his way, yes," said Whimsy. "The letter to me suggests it. But perhaps he hesitated. It's a national disease, you know. Moral indigestion. We swallow our scruples and never quite digest them." He smiled, but gently. "What do you mean to do with these?" "I don't know. Burn them, perhaps." "A merciful instinct," he said, rising. "But allow me to keep copies. The historian in me enjoys tidy footnotes." She hesitated, then nodded. "You won't publish them?" "Only to my conscience," he said. That evening, they dined quietly at the inn, where the same timid waitress who had once whispered about the murder now greeted Whimsy with awed familiarity. "You've become a legend, my lord," Agnes said with a hint of laughter. "They say the ghost of my uncle walks the vestry." "Heaven forbid," said Whimsy. "One ghost in a parish is charming. 2 becomes vulgar." He poured her wine. "You seem lighter, Miss Welby. Has the place forgiven itself?" Almost. The new vicar preaches shorter sermons. A step toward redemption, he said approvingly. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the murmur of the rain beginning again outside. Then she said softly, "Do you ever tire of it, of knowing too much about why people do dreadful things?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but curiosity is a cruel master. It gives no holidays." "And does it make you lonely?" He smiled, almost wistfully. "Occasionally. But then I've always preferred puzzles to people. They're easier to solve and far less noisy." The next morning, as he prepared to leave, Agnes handed him a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Something for you," she said. Inside was the folded music sheet, now neatly copied. "You should have it," she said. "You're the only one who might understand it." He thanked her gravely, promised to visit if ever his travels brought him north again, and took his leave. The bells accompanied him down the lane, their sound clear and melancholy. He found himself humming the melody from the music sheet as the train carried him south, its rhythm fitting oddly well with the rattle of the carriage. Back in London, he placed the score upon his piano and, after a brief hesitation, began to play. The melody was simple but haunting, the kind that lingers in the corners of the mind. There was something almost confessional in its slow ascent, as if each note struggled upward against gravity. When the final chord faded, he sat for a long while in silence, hands resting on the keys. Then he laughed quietly. "To the heavenly silence," he murmured. "Yes, Hubert, I suppose you've earned it." He leaned back, struck by an odd sense of contentment. Perhaps this was closure, after all, not in the legal sense, but in the quiet reconciliation of contradictions. The dead forgiven, the living chastened, and the curious once again left with nothing but the sound of thought. Outside, the city moved on, omnibuses clattering, vendors shouting, bells ringing somewhere far off, their tone blurred by distance. He stood by the window, watching the thin ribbon of smoke rise from the chimneys, and wondered how many crimes, large or small, were even now being prepared behind those walls. "Endless industry," he said softly. "England runs on guilt the way others run on coal." He turned away, smiling to himself, and went to pour another drink. The piano, as if reluctant to be silent, gave a faint echo when his sleeve brushed the keys. It sounded like the last sigh of a finished story, or perhaps merely the beginning of another. He raised his glass to it and said, "To Welby, to Lanchester, to Morton, and to Miss Welby's dreadful tea. May they all rest in whatever peace they can afford." As evening settled, Whimsy sat again at the instrument and played the melody once more, slower this time, until the notes faded entirely into the London dusk. The room filled with a stillness that felt almost sacred. He listened to it, smiling faintly, then spoke aloud, as if to the air, "Well, that will do for one lifetime's sermon." And for the first time in weeks, he felt no echo following him when the final chord dissolved into silence. It was some months later, in the late autumn of Arbre, that same year, when the affair of Dowerby St. Luke came back to Lord Peter Wimsey in a fashion both unexpected and faintly absurd. He was dining one evening with his brother, the Duke of Denver, in the sort of heavy, dignified gloom that clings to hereditary dining rooms like dust to velvet. Conversation had grown languid. The Duke's mind was on pheasants, and Peter's on the faintly discordant note struck by the dessert fork against a crystal dish. The butler entered with the post, arranging the envelopes before him with a precision only servants and murderers seemed to possess. Among them lay a square packet addressed in a hand that made him pause, a tight, deliberate script, faintly familiar. He opened it after a moment's hesitation. Inside lay a small book of hymns, its corners worn, and on the first page an inscription in Latin. Ut tacent, clamant. When they are silent, they cry out. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was written, "From one who understands bells." Whimsy smiled faintly, a dry twist of amusement flickering across his face. "A charming souvenir," he murmured, "though I do wonder which ghost has taken to correspondence." The Duke looked up, mildly exasperated. "Good Lord, Peter, don't tell me it's another of your confounded mysteries." "Only the echo of one," said Whimsy, slipping the hymn book into his pocket. "But echoes, you know, can be most insistent." Later that night, in his own flat, he studied the inscription again. The hand was not Miss Welby's. Too angular, too disciplined. Certainly not the Vicar's or Morton's, both now beyond correspondence. A faint scent of wax lingered about the pages, and in the gutter between the leaves he saw the thin smudge of soot, as though the book had once lain near a candle flame. A second note fell from between the hymns, unsigned, its message brief. "The bells will ring for him at midnight. Dowerby remembers." It was dated 2 days hence. An anniversary, then, he murmured. The dead returning to their appointed hour. He considered ignoring it. Sentimentality, especially rural sentimentality, bored him. And yet there was something theatrical about the gesture, something too deliberate to be the work of mere piety. He sighed. Once a detective, always a servant of inconvenience. 2 mornings later, his train rattled once again toward the north, through a landscape stripped bare of color and heavy with mist. The village appeared smaller, shabbier, as though time itself had conspired to forget it. The rectory shutters were drawn. Miss Welby, he learned from the innkeeper, had gone to stay with cousins in York. "Didn't care to be about for the bells ringing," the man said solemnly. "Too much memory in it." "Quite so," said Whimsy absently. "Memory is an untidy house guest." The church, when he reached it, stood as quiet and damp as a neglected tomb. The stones were green with moss. The air smelled of mold and history. Inside, he found the new vicar, a thin, scholarly fellow who blushed when addressed. "We're having the bells rung tonight," the man explained nervously. "In remembrance of all that happened. Miss Welby insisted before she left. She said it would be good for the village." "Redemption by acoustics," said Whimsy lightly. "A most Anglican form of therapy." The vicar smiled uncertainly, unsure whether he was being mocked. "You'll stay for the service?" "I never miss a performance," said Whimsy. He spent the afternoon wandering among the gravestones, reading the names and half remembering their associated whispers. There lay Arthur Welby, buried beneath a slab modest to the point of irony. Beside him, a small plaque for Reverend Hubert Lanchester, who had died in prison a month after his confession. Pneumonia, according to the papers, though Whimsy suspected despair had done the work. The bells above were silent, but he could sense their weight, their patient readiness. At dusk, the fog thickened. The villagers gathered slowly, their breath white in the cold air, their eyes glancing toward him with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Fame, he reflected, was a dreary substitute for privacy. When the clock struck 11, the vicar began his brief address, a pious attempt at reconciliation, all humility and strained chair. Whimsy barely listened. His gaze had fixed upon the tower. There, in the dim outline of the upper window, he thought he saw a movement, just a shadow shifting, perhaps the bell-ringer preparing his ropes. Yet when the first bell sounded, low and hollow, the figure did not move again. The peal began slowly, each note swelling and falling like breath. It was not the same melody as before. This was softer, almost mournful. The villagers listened in silence, their heads bowed. Then, between the tolls, Whimsy heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping, metal upon metal, too regular to be the wind. He moved toward the vestry door, quietly, unnoticed in the half-light. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of candle grease and damp stone. The tapping ceased. He waited. Then from the far corner, a whisper. It was not finished. "Indeed," said Whimsy calmly. Most sins rarely are. A figure stepped forward, a man in a laborer's coat, face half hidden by shadow. "You shouldn't be here," the man muttered. "Nor should you," said Whimsy, "but curiosity is a democratic vice." The man hesitated, then produced a small tarnished object from his pocket, a bell clapper detached from its hinge. "I took it," he said hoarsely, "after they buried him. Couldn't bear the sound of it anymore. Thought if I kept it, there'd be no more death here." "And has it worked?" asked Whimsy gently. "No," the man whispered. "The sound still comes. In my dreams. Every night since." His hands shook, the metal glinting faintly. "Who are you?" "Name's Jenkins," he said. "Gardener once. The bells, he made me clean them that night before evensong. I heard—" He stopped, shuddering. "I heard the blow. Didn't tell no one. Didn't want trouble. But it never stopped ringing after." "Conscience," said Whimsy softly, "has better acoustics than any church." He took the clapper from him and turned it over thoughtfully. "Well, Jenkins, you've carried your penance long enough. Leave the rest to the dead. They're better at silence." The man nodded, tears cutting clean paths through the grime on his face, and slipped away into the fog. When the final bell ceased, Whimsy stood alone beneath the tower, the clapper cold in his hand. The silence that followed was immense, almost holy. He felt a strange, weary peace settle over him, the sense of a story at last complete, even if imperfectly told. Outside, the fog had thickened into rain. He placed the clapper gently on the altar and whispered, "Let them rest." Then, with that characteristic flicker of irony that refused to desert him even at the edge of reverence, he added, "And let the living get on with their business of forgetting." He left the church just as the first light began to bleed through the mist. Behind him, the bells stood still, their work done. At the inn, a fire was being kindled, and someone had left a pot of coffee steaming by the hearth. He sat, listening to the rain and the faint creak of timbers, feeling both older and oddly lighter. Perhaps this was what redemption looked like, not the thunder of judgment, but the soft, almost embarrassed quiet that follows confession. He smiled, imagining the look on Harriet's face when he told her about the midnight bells. "You'll say I went chasing ghosts," he murmured to himself. "And perhaps I did. But ghosts, after all, make excellent company for those who dislike the living too much." By the time he boarded the morning train back to London, the fog had lifted and the countryside gleamed faintly gold under a shy sun. As the engine gathered speed, Whimsy took the hymn book from his pocket, opened it at random, and found the Latin inscription again. Ut tacent, clamant. He closed it and gazed out the window at the receding fields. "Yes," he said softly, "they cry out, but not forever." He leaned back, folded his hands, and let the rhythm of the train absorb him. When at last he dozed, it was not to the tolling of bells, but to their absence, a silence so perfect it almost sounded like peace. London, that ancient and ever-improvised machine of noise and consequence, swallowed Lord Peter Whimsy once again as though he had never left it. The cab wheels hissed on the wet pavement, and the air smelled faintly of ink, rain, and something indefinably tired. The city was at its most Novemberish, grey, respectable, slightly impatient with all forms of emotion, and Whimsy, stepping out before his flat in Piccadilly, felt at once restored and faintly diminished by its indifference. Dowerby St. Luke had been a whisper. London was a declaration, and declarations were easier to ignore. He hung up his hat, lit a cigarette, and stood for a moment gazing at the faint halo of smoke that rose toward the ceiling. The hymn book lay on his desk, the Latin inscription faintly visible in the lamplight. He turned it over absently, feeling the texture of the worn cover beneath his fingertips. There was, he thought, something distinctly un-English about sentimentality, yet he seemed lately to be acquiring the habit. He smiled ruefully. "Well, Peter," he murmured to himself, "you've acquired worse vices." He poured a glass of port and sank into the armchair by the fire, half amused, half melancholy, as though waiting for the next absurdity to arrive. The absurdity, as it happened, arrived not in the form of a letter this time, but of a person. Bunter entered with the quiet precision of a man who had already anticipated his master's thoughts and outpaced them. "Inspector Parker, my lord," he said, setting down the evening tray. "He says it's not urgent, but he looked amused, which generally means trouble." Whimsy grinned. "Show him in, Bunter. Nothing pleases me more than a policeman in good humor. It suggests someone else's tragedy." Parker appeared a moment later, rain still glistening on his hat brim, his face wearing that familiar mixture of exasperation and admiration which long acquaintance with whimsy seemed to produce. "Back from your pilgrimage among the repentant?" he asked. "Back, though not repentant," said Whimsy, waving him to a chair. "Have a drink and tell me what scandal London has invented in my absence." Parker accepted the port, leaned back and said, "Funny you should ask. There's a letter here from Yorkshire. Seems your Dowerby business isn't quite done." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "My dear Charles, if I didn't know better, I'd think you cultivated dramatic timing. Go on, what new resurrection?" Parker handed him the folded sheet. It was official-looking, from the diocesan office. The message was brief. The late Reverend Lanchester's effects, recently released from prison storage, contained documents possibly relevant to your investigation. Would Lord Peter Whimsy kindly advise? Whimsy read it twice, then smiled thinly. "Relevant? That's their delicate way of saying embarrassing, no doubt. The Church never destroys evidence. It merely misfiles it." He rose, crossed to the window, and looked out at the glimmering street lamps. "What do you think, Charles? Another journey north?" "I'd come along," Parker said. "A man needs amusement." Whimsy nodded. "Indeed. I'm sure the Almighty won't mind us borrowing his records for a weekend." They arrived in York 2 days later, the cold sharper now, the countryside brittle and colorless under a pale sun. The diocesan clerk received them with the sort of hesitant politeness reserved for secular intrusions into ecclesiastical order. He led them through a warren of corridors smelling of dust, wax, and mild despair, until at last they reached a small room lined with shelves. On the table lay a thin packet tied with blue ribbon. Whimsy untied it, revealing a set of letters, each written in Lanchester's small, meticulous hand. The first was addressed to the bishop, an apology that read more like a sermon than a confession. The second, however, was stranger. A letter addressed to Welby himself, never sent. "My dear Arthur," it began, "there is something monstrous in me that I have mistaken for faith. I have envied your certainty, though I have despised it. You made the bells speak, while I made them silent, thinking holiness required quiet. But it is silence that breeds sin. If there is forgiveness, it will sound like laughter, not prayer." Whimsy read it aloud softly, the words settling in the still air like dust. "You see, Charles, even damnation can be literate." The third document was shorter, a small page torn from a notebook. Upon it was a list of names and sums, half erased, but one caught Whimsy's eye. A. Welby, 200, H.L., 200. "So they repaid each other in guilt," he murmured. "A partnership of piety and theft. How beautifully symmetrical." Parker frowned. "You think Welby took the money first?" "No. I think he discovered it missing, replaced it from his own funds, and planned to expose Lanchester later. The good Reverend panicked, seeing not exposure, but damnation. And there you have it. One sermon, one corpse, and one immortal irony." He folded the papers carefully and slipped them back into the packet. "We'll send copies to the diocese. Let them decide whether truth is edifying or inconvenient." That evening they dined in the inn at York, the fire crackling cheerfully against the cold. Parker watched Whimsy over his glass. "You've gone quiet," he said. "Unusual for you." "I was thinking," said Whimsy, "that if men like Lanchester and Welby could see how small their crimes look against eternity, they might have saved us all the paperwork." He smiled faintly. "It's always the decent ones who break spectacularly. The wicked are professionals. They pace themselves." Parker laughed. "You make sin sound like cricket." "It rather is," said Whimsy. "A long game of rules and patience, occasionally interrupted by divine weather." The next morning he rose early and walked alone through the minster before their train south. The great nave stood empty, the air heavy with incense and old light. He moved among the shadows, listening to the faint echoes of his footsteps. Somewhere far above, the bells began to ring the quarter hour. Slow and measured. He stopped, eyes half closed, letting the sound fill him. Each note seemed both judgment and absolution, as if the world itself were attempting to speak. "Ut tacent, clamant," he murmured, smiling. "Yes, you do cry out, but only to remind us that we're listening." By the time they reached London that evening, the fog had returned, softening the lamps into halos. Whimsy parted from Parker at the station and walked home through the drizzle, content in that peculiar melancholy that follows the end of something properly finished. In his flat, the hymn book still lay upon the piano. He opened it once more, found the line he'd read too often, and beneath it wrote in his neat, ironic hand, and yet the silence was not in vain. Then, because he could not resist, he sat at the piano and played the melody again, slower, letting each note fade into the next until the room was filled not with music, but with the gentle, forgiving hum of its aftermath. The clock struck midnight. He looked up, listening. For a moment, he fancied he heard distant bells answering from somewhere beyond the fog. Soft, deliberate, perfectly in tune. "Good night, Dowerby," he said quietly, "and may you never find reason to ring again." He closed the piano lid, extinguished the lamp, and stood for a moment in the half-dark, the faint smell of wax and rain mingling in the air. Then Lord Peter Whimsy, private detective, amateur philosopher, and reluctant moralist, smiled that small, ironic smile of his and murmured, "Even in silence there's a kind of applause." He left the room without looking back, and the last echo of his footsteps died away into the waiting, civilized quiet of London. The winter that followed was long, dry, and faintly disinterested in the affairs of men, as if the world itself had grown weary of explanations. Lord Peter Whimsy, however, found himself unaccountably restless. The Dowerby case, so neatly concluded, so delicately balanced between tragedy and redemption, refused to fade into the comfortable oblivion where solved mysteries usually went. He caught himself, more than once, pausing mid-sentence in conversation, as though a faint echo had called his name. It was not guilt nor sentimentality. He disliked both. Rather, it was the sensation of having glimpsed something essential and then having it quietly slip away, like a word forgotten on the tip of the tongue. He took to long walks through the damp London parks, his breath visible in the frosty air, his gloved hands clasped behind him. The ducks and the pensioners shared the space with equal indifference. "You'd think," he mused one afternoon, "that after unmasking clergymen, outsmarting solicitors, and exercising a few moral phantoms, a man might earn a little peace." But peace, it seemed, was a state reserved for the unimaginative. The bells of Dowerby still rang faintly in his memory, each toll accompanied by that peculiar blend of pity and irony he could never quite separate. One evening, returning home through a fine sleet that glittered under the lamps, he found a small parcel waiting for him on the hall table. The label bore no sender's name, only the words, "By hand, urgent." He carried it to the fire and opened it with mild curiosity. Inside lay a single envelope, and beneath it a brass object wrapped in cloth. The letter was unsigned. "Forgive me," but I could not let it lie. There is one bell less in Dowerby tonight. It fell without cause. The clapper was missing. He unwrapped the cloth. There, gleaming dully in the firelight, lay the same clapper he had left upon the altar months before. For a moment he simply stared, then laughed softly. They do come back, don't they? Like inconvenient truths. He held it up to the light, turning it between his fingers. The metal was colder than it should have been, heavy with a silence that seemed almost deliberate. Bunter entered then, saw the object, and raised an eyebrow with the tact of a man who has long ceased to be surprised by his master's relics. "A souvenir, my lord." "A confession, perhaps," said Whimsy. "Though not mine." He placed the clapper on the mantel and watched it gleam like a fossil of sound. The next morning brought an article in the Times. Bell collapse at Dowerby St. Luke. No casualties. It was brief, factual, and faintly embarrassed, as English journalism always is when the supernatural might be suspected. The report mentioned that the bell had fallen during morning prayers and that the congregation had escaped unharmed. "A miracle," said the Reverend's replacement, quoted with admirable restraint. Whimsy folded the paper thoughtfully. "A miracle," he echoed, "or a final protest." He could not resist the impulse. By noon he was on the train north again, the brass clapper wrapped in his coat pocket. The church stood exactly as he remembered it, humble, damp, and faintly resentful of attention. The tower was half-boarded, the ropes coiled like snakes beside the nave. The vicar greeted him nervously, relieved perhaps that someone else might assume responsibility for explaining divine interference. "It simply dropped," he said. "No wind, no strain, no warning." Whimsy smiled. "Even saints, my dear Reverend, occasionally tire of standing upright." He examined the fallen bell where it lay behind the churchyard wall. Its surface was split by a long crack, clean and unmistakable. "Metal fatigue," murmured the vicar. "Age, perhaps." "Or guilt," said Whimsy under his breath. He took the clapper from his pocket and held it near the bell's jagged edge. It fit perfectly. For a moment he was absurdly tempted to reattach it, to let the sound live again, but something stopped him. The memory of that night's silence, complete and unsullied. He laid the clapper down on the grass instead. "Let it rest," he said softly. "The music's over." That night he dined alone at the inn, the only guest save for a farmer and 2 traveling salesmen. The fire smoked, the ale was indifferent, and the mood was exactly to his liking. He found himself oddly content, even cheerful. A bell that refused to stay hung, he mused aloud. There's theology in that somewhere. When the innkeeper asked whether he'd come to write an article about it, Whimsy smiled. "No," he said, "I'm only here to listen to what isn't being said." Later, walking back toward the rectory lane, he paused to look at the tower. The moon hung behind it, thin and white, outlining the broken spire. For the first time since the case began, he felt no curiosity, no urge to pry further. The mystery, he realized, was not in the crime but in the persistence of memory, the refusal of silence to remain silent. He laughed quietly. Even the dead dislike being misquoted. He returned to London the following day, carrying nothing but his gloves and an inexplicable sense of finality. The clapper he left behind, buried discreetly beneath the yew. When he reached his flat, he found Harriet waiting, seated by the fire with a book open on her lap. "You've been chasing echoes again," she said without looking up. "Only one," he admitted, sinking into the chair opposite her. "It fell on my head, metaphorically speaking." "And did it sing?" "Not quite," he said. It sighed. She closed the book and regarded him over the rim of her spectacles. "You're beginning to sound like a theologian." "Heaven forbid," said Whimsy. "Though I confess there's a certain charm in the divine footnote. The moralists always forget to proofread." She smiled. "And what have you learned this time?" He thought for a moment. That some silences are not to be broken, and some truths improve by staying unspoken. The world doesn't need all its riddles solved, only the ones that inconvenience it. They dined quietly, the conversation wandering from poetry to scandal, from theology to jazz. Outside, the rain began again, steady and persistent. After Harriet had gone, he sat by the fire alone, the sound of the city muffled beneath the weather. He took up the hymn book once more, flipping through its pages until he reached the inscription he had written months before. Beneath it, he added another line, "And those who listen shall be changed, though they do not understand." He set down the pen and closed the book with a small, decisive motion. "That's the end of it," he said aloud, though he knew perfectly well it wasn't. Cases never ended. They only grew quieter with distance. When the clock struck midnight, he rose, drew the curtains, and stood for a while, looking out over the rain-slicked street. Far away, from some church whose name he did not know, came the faint toll of bells. 12 slow notes, deliberate and precise. He smiled, not with irony this time, but with something gentler, almost grateful. "There you are," he whispered. "Still ringing. Still reminding us we're not alone in the silence." He turned back to the fire, poured himself one last glass of port, and sat down, the light flickering across his thoughtful face. The bells faded into the hum of the city, replaced by the rhythmic drip of rain against the windows. He felt the faint tremor of peace. Fragile, earned, incomplete, but peace nonetheless. When he finally extinguished the lamp and let the room sink into darkness, the silence that followed seemed to breathe rather than rest, as though the air itself remembered the sound it had once carried. And in that living quiet, Lord Peter Wimsey, detective, aristocrat, and reluctant confessor to other people's sins, smiled once more and murmured, "Even now the bells are kind." Then, content at last, he closed his eyes, leaving the world to its noise, its secrets, and its endlessly patient silence. The following morning, London was wrapped in a thin veil of mist, the kind that softens the edges of reality and gives even the most familiar streets a curious ambiguity. Lord Peter Wimsey stood at his window, looking out over the bustling thoroughfare, the familiar din of carts, shouts, and hoofbeats mingling with the smell of wet stone and coal smoke. Despite the noise, there was a clarity to the day, a sense that the world had somehow exhaled after its recent perturbations. He poured himself a cup of tea, black and strong, and regarded the steam rising from the china as though it might reveal some hidden truth. The Dowerby affair, now months behind him, still lingered in his mind, not as a case, but as a constellation of human behavior. Vanity, pride, fear, and the subtle morality of those who kill out of necessity rather than malice. Yet there was a faint echo of incompleteness, an almost imperceptible ripple in the otherwise settled water. Perhaps it was natural that some resolutions should carry a residual tension, like a faint hum beneath the surface of calm. He had barely finished his tea when Bunter entered, carrying a small bundle. "A visitor, my lord," he said. "She insists upon seeing you without delay." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. "From Dowerby, I presume?" "Yes, my lord. Miss Welby, and she seems determined." He placed the bundle on the table, a folder tied with ribbon, and a small brass key attached to it. Wimsey examined the key, noting the careful engraving. "Vestry, 1A. A relic," he murmured. "Or an invitation." Within minutes, a carriage arrived to carry him north once more, the city dissolving behind him into smoke and rain, the wheels on the cobblestones echoing like distant bells. He wondered briefly if the visit would merely revisit old memories, or if it would stir fresh currents in the otherwise placid pond of the parish. Either way, curiosity had a voice he could never quite resist. Upon arrival at Dowerby, The village seemed unchanged, deceptively tranquil beneath a low, grey sky. The church stood solemn and silent, the tower still bare where the last bell had fallen months before. Miss Welby met him at the rectory gate, her expression guarded but resolute. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I fear there is more to the story, documents I only recently found, and perhaps a truth that none of us quite understood." She led him into the study, where a small fire glimmered feebly, casting long shadows. On the desk lay several letters and a thin journal, the handwriting immediately recognizable as Lanchester's. Whimsy picked up the journal, flipping through pages with slow, deliberate care. The entries were meticulous, full of theological speculation, personal musings, and what seemed at first to be trivial observations about parish life. Yet beneath the surface, he detected patterns, repeated mentions of sums of money, cryptic references to meetings with Morton, and small notes about the bells that suggested deliberate planning rather than incidental observation. "It is the faint tremor beneath the sermon," he murmured. "The undercurrent of intent visible only to those who listen carefully." Miss Welby sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes occasionally darting to him with that blend of anticipation and unease that accompanies one who holds dangerous knowledge. "I found these letters," she said softly, "while going through the vicar's old papers. I cannot make sense of all of it, but I felt you should see it." Whimsy nodded, examining a letter addressed to Welby from Lanchester. The tone was formal, almost affectionate, and yet there was an edge of unease, a subtle pressure. "Arthur, the sums are not as expected. One must act before discovery is made. Silence, my friend, is our ally." He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Here it is again," he said. "The insistence on silence. Not merely moral, but operational. Lanchester feared exposure, but he framed it as piety." "And yet," said Miss Welby, "my uncle kept discovering things. He had letters and accounts I did not understand. He seemed worried." "Ah," said Whimsy, "but worry is the mortal's hand on a divine lever. Your uncle's discovery, his attempts to reconcile the sums, set in motion everything that followed. The blow, the panic, the concealment, it all derives from his persistence in understanding. Fate, my dear, is often algebra performed badly." He moved to the window, looking out at the tower, now cordoned and empty. The air was still, the village holding its breath as though aware that some final act was imminent. "We must reconstruct the sequence," he said, returning to the desk. "Every letter, every sum, every whispered instruction. The solution does not lie merely in who struck whom, but in the order, the timing, and the motivations that remained invisible until now." He spread the documents on the desk, arranging them with the precision of a surgeon preparing instruments. Each note from Lanchester was aligned with its corresponding date, cross-referenced with Morton's transactions and Welby's annotations. "Observe," he said, tapping a page, "the repeated insistence on certain amounts, on certain timings. The vicar's panic is a function of arithmetic and fear, not malice, and the murderer's opportunity, Morton, of course, is entirely derivative, constrained by the temporal mechanics of the parish." As he spoke, Miss Welby leaned closer, her breath visible in the cold room. "So everything is connected," she said. "Even the clapper, the falling bell, the letters, everything." "Indeed," said Whimsy, "like a fugue, each voice distinct, yet part of the same motif. The murder was but the final chord, inevitable once all preceding measures were played." He paused, considering the faintly sinister elegance of the arrangement. "And here," he added, lifting a small folded paper, "is the postscript, a note to the bishop, never sent, which clarifies intention, motivation, and perhaps even conscience. It is the confession unspoken, the truth that lives quietly beneath the surface of events." The most telling evidence often arrives in silence, as we have long suspected. Miss Welby's eyes widened. And what should be done with it? Wimsey smiled faintly. Preserve it for history, for posterity, and for those who may study morality without the distraction of theatrics. Some truths are best left to the ages, rather than the courts. Mortality is far too impatient to grasp subtlety. He rose, pacing slowly, absorbing the weight of the papers, the quiet gravity of the rectory. Outside, the wind rustled the bare branches, faintly echoing the tone of the bells that no longer tolled. In truth, he said softly, the living are often more responsible for sound than the dead. Our task is to listen carefully, and sometimes to interpret silence as we would speech. By the time he departed, the sky had grown dim and a fine drizzle had begun. The rectory stood solemn and patient, the churchyard quiet, the air thick with the memory of what had passed. He placed the documents carefully in his bag, slung the clapper over his arm, and walked slowly through the village, noting the patterns in the frost, the geometry of shadows, the subtle angles where sunlight struck the church windows. Each detail seemed to whisper of intention and consequence, a lattice of human behavior that only the most observant could untangle. The train awaited, and as it carried him back south, he looked out over the glimmering fields, the fog retreating, and felt a strange satisfaction. The case, in its public sense, was concluded, yet the private harmonics, the subtle echoes of motive, fear, and conscience, remained intact, preserved like music only faintly remembered but fully understood. By evening, back in London, he settled once more by the fire, removing the clapper from its wrapping and placing it carefully on the mantel. Harriet Vane entered, carrying a small stack of papers for him to examine. "You've been busy," she said lightly, observing the meticulous order of the documents spread across the table. "As always," said Wimsey, though in this instance the business was with silence itself. He leaned back, letting the shadows play across his face, listening to the muffled city noises outside. The clapper caught the lamplight faintly, a mute testimony to events past, yet still charged with significance. "Everything is accounted for now," he said softly. "The dead are at peace, the living informed, and the truth, however quiet, is properly understood." Harriet smiled faintly, sensing both the completion and the lingering weight of it all. He raised his glass in a gentle, ironic salute. "To the final chord," he murmured, "and to those who can still hear it." And with that, the room sank into a quiet that was deliberate yet comforting, as though the world itself had paused to acknowledge the resolution of a story told with patience, wit, and the inescapable precision of reason. The winter deepened, drawing long grey shadows across London streets, and Lord Peter Wimsey found himself once more in his flat, the fire crackling faintly, the room steeped in the peculiar mixture of smoke, ink, and expectation that always seemed to attend him after a case concluded. Despite the peace of the city outside, he felt a subtle restlessness, a quiet insistence that there were still echoes left to attend to, details that had slipped past even his own careful observation. The clapper from Dowerby rested on the mantel, its brass surface catching the lamplight and reflecting a faint shimmer across the ceiling. He regarded it for a long moment, remembering the fallen bell, the sequence of letters, the panic in Lanchester's hand, and the meticulous arrangements of Morton. It was an artifact, a reminder that human motives were never neat, even when the evidence seemed complete. Bunter entered quietly, carrying the post and laying a stack of letters on the table. Wimsey's eyes flicked over them, noting one envelope distinguished by its provincial hand and faint scent of lavender. He opened it, revealing a note addressed from Miss Agnes Welby. The words were measured and careful. "My Lord Wimsey, I trust you will not consider my intrusion untimely, but there is a matter which demands attention before it becomes history rather than truth. Please advise me at your convenience." He read it twice, then smiled faintly. "Ah, the living are always more inventive than the dead," he murmured. "And Miss Welby has the persistence of a cat." By mid-morning, he was aboard a northbound train, the countryside blurred by frost and drizzle, each tree and fence post marching past in the monotony of travel. He reflected upon the peculiar durability of certain details, the way a minor gesture or forgotten letter could ripple through time to become pivotal. Dowerby St. Luke, in his memory, remained a village of polite facades concealing passionate disorder, each inhabitant caught between conscience and convenience, and yet it had achieved a strange equilibrium. The bells, the letters, the clapper, all were elements of a choreography, human behavior set to the rhythm of morality and error. He considered what Miss Welby might have discovered this time, what new element had compelled her to summon him across the distance. Perhaps it was a forgotten document, or a moral complication overlooked by the vicar, or simply the weight of memory demanding articulation. In either case, he was eager to attend. Mystery, even in its subtler forms, was a friend to his temperament. When he arrived, the village seemed almost asleep beneath its winter pall. The rectory, the church, the hedgerows, all appeared as though they had been dusted and returned to order. But Whimsy knew better. Order, like silence, was often provisional. Beneath it lay the residue of human imperfection, the subtle tremors of decisions, secrets, and regrets. Miss Welby greeted him at the gate, her expression taut but resolute, and led him to the study where the fire burned low. On the desk lay a neat bundle of papers and a small, thin journal tied with ribbon. She handed it to him, hesitating. "These were found in a compartment I only recently discovered. I cannot make full sense of them, but I thought you might." Whimsy smiled faintly. "And I shall, of course, be delighted to apply myself to the indecipherable. It is, after all, the proper exercise of my curiosity." The papers were letters, memos, and brief diary entries, primarily in Lanchester's meticulous script. Whimsy examined them with the care of a man tending delicate machinery. Here was a note to Welby, half-written, suggesting caution in the matter of parish funds. There, a memo to Morton indicating concern about missed signatures, and, in between, small observations about bells, sermons, and the behavior of the congregation. Every line was a thread, and he traced them carefully, noting the subtle consistencies, the faint discrepancies, the small, almost invisible signs of human anxiety. "See here," he murmured, tapping the margin of a letter. "He speaks of sums, timings, and quiet observation." The blow was less about malice than fear of exposure, and yet exposure alone was insufficient. It required silence to be effective. Observe how deliberate his notation is. Observe how the arithmetic of conscience operates even beneath the veil of piety. Miss Welby watched him closely, her hands folded in her lap, eyes attentive yet apprehensive. "Do you think there is anything actionable here?" she asked. "Actionable, perhaps, in the sense of understanding human nature," said Whimsy, "but not in the conventional legal sense. Most truths, Miss Welby, are not meant to be litigated. They are meant to be comprehended, catalogued, and, when necessary, forgiven." He tapped a page. "Consider this note. Sums diverted, observations made, moral panic recorded. The murderer, Morton, reacted to the arithmetic, not to emotion, and Lanchester panicked at the perception of exposure. It is the interplay of understanding and fear that produces consequence, far more than malice or intent alone." By late afternoon, they moved the discussion to the church, the building quiet, the winter light casting long, sharp shadows through the nave. Whimsy walked among the pews, noting the angles of sunlight, the placement of doors, the faint echoes of steps. "Acoustics," he murmured, "are a reliable measure of intent." Sound behaves as the human conscience does. It travels where it is not wanted, it lingers, and it repeats what the living often wish to conceal. He gestured toward the vestry, recalling the night of the murder. Every decision, every panic, every minor intervention, this space remembers. And it communicates subtly, through gaps, through echoes, through small, missed movements. That is why it matters what Miss Welby has brought. These documents, when considered against place and circumstance, reveal the precise mechanics of human folly. They spent hours reconstructing sequences, timelines, and interactions, tracing the delicate threads of coincidence, fear, and intent. Whimsy's notes sprawled across the desk, diagrams and marginalia interleaved with the original papers. Every so often, he would lean back, glance at Miss Welby, and remark softly on the poetic, tragic precision of human error. "Do you see, Miss Welby? The vicar's panic, Morton's opportunity, your uncle's discovery. They are all vectors converging upon one point, the moment of action. It is almost musical in its inevitability. The notes may be quiet, but the composition is flawless." She nodded, impressed by the clarity he brought to chaos, though still unsettled by the cold precision of his logic. By evening, the room was dim, the fire reduced to embers. Whimsy stood, folding the papers carefully and returning them to their ribbons. "The case, in its final articulation, is complete," he said softly. "The dead are accounted for, the living informed, and the consequences, like music, can be appreciated without disturbance." Outside, the wind sighed through the rectory trees, carrying with it the faint resonance of memory. He paused, glancing at the small pile of letters, the hymn book, the brass clapper resting quietly on the mantel. "All is as it should be," he murmured, measured, resolved, and, for once, quiet. When he departed that night, the village was still, the church tower stark against the faint glow of moonlight. Each step he took along the lane seemed to echo with purpose, though it was only the natural rhythm of boots on frost. The clapper remained in place, the letters secured, the story archived in memory and in print. He paused briefly at the gate, looking back at the rectory and the church. "Good night, Dowerby," he said softly, "and may your silence endure beyond the ears of men." He turned, walking toward the waiting train, and as it carried him south, he felt the rare, delicate satisfaction that comes when a story has been told with precision, wit, and a full comprehension of human nature, leaving the world, at least for a moment, in perfect and patient quiet.